Hello, everyone. How's it going? This is the Bald Mitchell Nerd coming at you with another lovely music discussion vid. Obviously, we've read the title, so let's dive right into it. The question is there a, right amount of time between albums? Well, I wouldn't say there's one in particular. I will give an opinion, but it's not universally applicable because it really just depends on a number of things. So, let's talk about. Um, we're going to review something in the past. It's not really relevant now, but just to kind of illustrate a point. These two albums here, Black Sabbath's first two albums, these both came out in 1970. Obviously, we got the debut and Paranoid. Both came out in 1970. These are both watershed albums for metal, clearly, right? But they came out in the same year. In 2019, are we going to have a band come along and release two watershed albums for a genre in the same year? I'm going to say no. That's not too likely to happen. It's not impossible, but not too likely to happen. So, but that just illustrates how different or how much the music industry has changed in the decades since the 70s, right? It used to be really common for bands to put out an album every year. Hell, even multiple albums in one year definitely wasn't unheard of or extremely uncommon. So it used to be very compressed, the album cycle. I think probably, later into the 70s and the 80s, they basically kind of standardized around a, 1 to 2 year cycle between albums. It was pretty normal for most bands. Of course, it wasn't universal. There are always exceptions, but I would say the 1 to 2 year cycle was pretty common from the 80s until really the mid to late 90s was not unheard of. And a lot of bands have really fallen away from that. Now, there are still some bands, Overkill being a prime example, that can still put out really good material, kind of like clockwork. I mean, Overkill puts out a good or a great album every 2 years. Precious few bands do that now. Overkill is kind of in a class, a very small class at this point. So there you go. They're kind of hanging on to the traditional album cycle. And then some bands can, of course, go the other direction. Tool is, of course, the first band that springs to mind. It's been 13 years since their last album. They've finally announced that the follow-up to 10,000 Days, is coming out 10,000 days after that album came out. 13 years is a pretty long time in between albums, but hey, whatever. That's obviously way too far in the other direction. For a less extreme but still kind of ridiculous example, we have this. We have Hardwired to Self-Destruct that came out 8 years after Death Magnetic. 8 years is too long as well, just so you know. So what would I say is, quote, ideal in the modern, late 2010s, going into the 2020s? What would I say is probably the ideal album space release? I would say probably somewhere between 2 to 4 years in between albums is probably pretty close to ideal. And the reason I say that now is if you do it faster than 2 years between albums, with the amount of albums that are just flying out and that people can easily hear thanks to the internet, if you do it more often than that, you're oversaturating a bit, because it's nice to be able to take in an album and process it for a little bit, before something new comes out. If you're having a new album coming out, every year or hell, multiple times a year, people are going to have a hard time really processing it and absorbing it and all that. Now, it's not really, that's not a new phenomenon because we're in the current year, but it's kind of a general observation. And the reason I say that is there's so many things compete. It's maybe a little more pronounced now than it was back in the 70s. The reason I say that is because there's so many more things competing for our attention now than there used to be. So there's that whole thing. But you know, going too long, the problem with that is you go past that 4-year mark, people will, a lot of advanced people lose interest in them if they go too long without releasing something. People will be like, are they even still a band? Are they still even doing anything? Obviously, bands like Tool and Metallica are kind of the exception because they're so massively famous and have these giant fan bases. But if you're like, a smaller band, I think going, much longer than that's a pretty bad idea because your fans will probably, the attention span can definitely wane. So I know that there's a whole multitude of factors that can influence how long the album cycle is. Obviously, how long you tour, personnel changes, disasters, personal things that happen to band members. All whole multitudes of things can influence this album cycle. It's not just like you can say, okay, we're going to do it this often, and then that's always what's going to happen. Things happen. Things can get in the way. Other projects can impact it, but there's a whole multitude of things. But I would say, quote, what's ideal, 2 to 4 years. I'd really be interested, obviously, hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below if you think I'm close, off, whatever. If you want to see albums more often, less often, you don't care, whatever, let me know. So that's it. You guys know what to do with all the wonderful stuff. Thanks so much for watching. As always, live long and prosper. See you next time.